December 1944. Deep inside Belgium's Ardennes wilderness, a young American rifleman huddles in a narrow trench carved into the frozen earth. The thermometer hovers around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of cold that clamps down on bone and marrow. Snow whips across the landscape, piling on helmets, filling pockets, crusting over the edges of the foxhole until everything, gear, skin, spirit, feels stiff and brittle. For 3 days, he hasn't dared remove his boots. He knows exactly what waits inside them, and the fear of confirming it keeps him paralyzed. But now the ache has turned to something worse. The eerie sensation of nothing at all. Not painful cold. Not burning cold. Just emptiness, as if his feet no longer belong to him. Finally, with trembling fingers, he unlaces his boot and pulls it off. A sharp, sour smell rises. His wool sock squishes like a sponge. The wetness isn't melted snow, not spilled water. It's his own sweat, trapped with nowhere to escape. For 72 hours, moisture has clung to his skin, unable to evaporate in the sealed chamber of his boot. Ice crystals sparkle inside the fabric like tiny shards of glass. His foot, ghost white and swollen, glistens under the weak winter light. When he presses a finger to his toes, nothing responds. The earliest stage of trench foot. If he is fortunate, the condition will stop there. If not, the next step is frostbite. Tissue dying. Blackened flesh. Amputation. And just a few hundred yards away, across a snow-choked no-man's land, another soldier crouches in a similar hole. Same snowstorm. Same freezing winds. Same sleepless nights. Same lack of fresh socks or dry shoes. But that man is German, and when he pulls off his boot, steam curls into the air. His feet are warm. Dry. Alive. Same continent. Same war. Same brutal winter. Yet the consequences are worlds apart. The American cannot understand it. His army-issued boots, specifically engineered for cold weather combat, footwear designed by respected manufacturers like United States Rubber Company, backed by years of industrial knowledge and tested to military standards. The M-1944 Shoepac was supposed to be the ultimate answer to winter warfare, a marvel of American production, a tool of survival. So why, in the middle of this frozen hell, is the enemy walking with confidence while he fears the loss of his toes? The truth begins with a single, fundamental design decision. One choice American engineers believed was smart, efficient, and modern. A decision that seemed flawless on paper yet unraveled disastrously in real-world combat. To understand the breakdown, we must travel backwards. Back before the Ardennes, before the Shoepac, before American soldiers marched into the European winter. We must return to 1942, to the vast killing grounds of the Eastern Front, to a very different kind of boot that quietly saved the feet and lives of thousands of German troops. Before the American design froze countless soldiers, before American engineers ever touched their first blueprint, the Germans had already pioneered a weapon against the cold. The Filzstiefel, the felt boot. When the Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, they arrived with standard leather marching boots, perfect for warm conditions, catastrophic for the winter that followed. The Russian cold of 1941 to 42 became a nightmare beyond imagination. Thousands of German soldiers didn't fall to bullets or artillery, but to frostbite. Entire units lost their ability to fight. Men collapsed with blackened feet. Amputation skyrocketed. The German high command realized they were on the verge of losing not only territory, but entire battalions to the climate alone. They needed a miracle, and fast. Desperation pushed German engineers to study local solutions. They examined the traditional Valenki, the wool felt boots Russian villagers had worn for generations. Primitive at first glance, but astonishingly effective. Warm even when damp. Insulating even at sub-zero temperatures. Breathable. Simple. Efficient. Germany copied the idea and reshaped it for military needs. By late 1942, the first Filzstiefel rolled off production lines. Thick, densely felted wool boots reinforced with leather soles and lower panels. Not beautiful, not elegant, but designed for one job: survival. These boots soon became the backbone of German winter equipment on the Eastern Front. Their design relied on a principle as old as civilization itself. Wool breathes. It allows sweat to evaporate. It traps air for insulation, and it continues to perform even when damp. Soldiers wearing them reported astounding results. Days in temperatures below zero, nights spent standing watch in howling blizzards, forced marches through endless snowdrifts, yet their feet remained intact, warm enough to function, dry enough to keep blood flowing, protected enough to avoid frostbite even in -20, -30 or worse. The boots weren't perfect. They failed in mud. They turned heavy when drenched. They were less durable than leather boots. But in the kind of punishing dry cold that dominated the Russian front, they were invaluable. German infantry, tank crews, artillerymen, and mountain troops adopted them as essential gear. And the Americans knew this. Allied intelligence assessed captured felt boots carefully. They gathered reports from prisoners, field observations, and battlefield recoveries. They saw how German frostbite injuries were lower than expected despite extreme conditions. They recognized that the German approach, using wool felt for most of the boot, minimizing barriers to breathability, was working remarkably well. So, with this knowledge available, what did the United States Army do? The Quartermaster Corps understood that World War II would involve fighting in harsh winters. They remembered the frostbite disasters of World War I. They knew they needed a modern, specialized winter boot, one that could withstand snow, freezing rain, and muddy terrain. Their goal wasn't just warmth. It was versatility, durability, manufacturability, and waterproofing. Thus, they turned to U.S. Rubber Company, Goodyear, and other leading manufacturers to create a new kind of cold weather boot. Their answer was the M-1944 Shoepac, designed and tested throughout the early years of the war and put into mass production by 1944. On paper, the Shoepac seemed brilliant. It used three components: a thick rubber lower half to block water, a sturdy leather upper for structure and support, a removable wool felt insole for insulation. To engineers, this design solved multiple problems at once. Rubber would stop external moisture, streams, melting snow, slush, from entering the boot. Leather would maintain durability. The felt insole could be removed and dried, then reinserted. Soldiers would receive extra insoles to rotate as needed. In controlled tests under moderate conditions, the system seemed to work. Reports appeared positive. Factories ramped up output. American planners believed they had created superior winter footwear, more adaptable than the German felt boot, more protective, more modern. But distribution was slow, tangled in bureaucracy and wartime chaos. By the time many units received their Shoepacs, the harshest phase of the Battle of the Bulge had already crippled the Allied line. And when the boots did finally reach frontline troops, the soldiers made a chilling discovery. The design was fundamentally flawed, not because of poor quality, not because of weak materials, not because of mistakes in manufacturing, but because the engineers misunderstood one essential truth. Waterproof boots trap sweat. The rubber bottom, intended as protection, became a prison. Sweat had nowhere to escape. It accumulated hour after hour. Socks soaked through. Felt insoles turned soggy. Moisture pressed against skin and freezing air. A perfect recipe for heat loss and frostbite. In the German felt boots, vapor from sweat drifted outward through the breathable wool. But in the American Shoepac, it hit an airtight wall. The interior stayed wet, and as temperatures plummeted each night, that trapped moisture froze solid. Men woke to find ice embedded in their socks. Frozen insoles stuck to their skin, toes stiff and colorless. Blood circulation slowing to dangerous levels. In a battlefield environment, where fires could not always be lit and boots could not be removed for hours, sometimes days, the problem escalated rapidly. Soldiers simply reinserted their freezing, wet feet into the same cold rubber shells each morning. Every hour compounded the damage. Medical officers soon witnessed an avalanche of cold weather injuries. Aid stations filled with cases of trench foot, frostbite, and dead tissue. Surgeons amputated blackened toes. Entire companies reported 20 to 30% losses to cold alone. By the end of the winter, between 46,000 and 71,000 U.S. troops suffered cold injuries in Europe. During the Battle of the Bulge alone, over 15,000 soldiers fell victim not to German firepower, but to winter, and the boots intended to protect them. The tragedy wasn't just inevitable, it was preventable. America had access to the same observations Germany used. They studied German boots. They understood why felt worked. But logistical priorities, manufacturing capabilities, and a misplaced faith in waterproofing led them in a different direction. A direction that cost thousands of men their feet, their mobility, and in some cases, their lives. When the first shipments of winter footwear finally reached frontline American units, they arrived far too late to spare countless soldiers who had already been struggling through blizzards and mud in their thin, everyday service shoes covered with overshoes that barely provided protection. But even after these long-awaited shoe packs were finally distributed, the relief commanders hoped for never materialized. The problems remained. And while exhausted American infantrymen battled the freezing winds of the Ardennes, the intelligence reports coming in from the processing centers for captured German soldiers painted a strange and unsettling contrast. Germans who had been pulled off the Eastern Front, men who had endured bitter cold for far longer stretches, showed surprisingly healthy, uninjured feet. Their boots told a story American analysts could no longer ignore. Officers from the intelligence branch began gathering every model of captured German winter footwear they could find. They dissected them, compared construction patterns, interviewed prisoners with engineering or supply backgrounds, and cross-referenced casualty statistics from different German theaters. A single, unavoidable truth began to emerge. German troops who had gone into winter with proper cold weather equipment, most critically their thick wool felt boots, were faring dramatically better than American soldiers who were now collapsing from cold injuries at alarming rates. The environments were similar. The temperatures were equally brutal. The difference wasn't the weather or the grit of the individual soldier. It was the gear, and more importantly, the philosophy behind its design. Inside the German felt boot, the investigators found a simple idea executed with precision. The entire upper portion was built from dense wool felt, a material that breathed naturally and allowed vapor to escape with minimal resistance. Leather appeared only where reinforcement was absolutely necessary. The overall structure avoided trapping moisture. When they examined the American Shoepac, however, the contrast was stark. The bottom half was made entirely of thick rubber, which extended several inches up the foot and lower ankle. This rubber barrier was watertight, but also airtight. No moisture could pass through it. Army specialists began running field studies under real combat conditions. They measured the moisture buildup inside boots worn by soldiers on long patrols, analyzed variations in internal temperature, and compared the data to medical records. Their findings confirmed what the infantry already knew from bitter experience. The rubber lower half of the shoepac, though excellent at keeping outside water from getting in, also sealed sweat inside the boot. That trapped moisture chilled rapidly in freezing weather, accelerating the onset of trench foot and frostbite. The flaw wasn't in the workmanship. It wasn't in the materials. It came directly from the priorities the engineers had chosen when they designed the boot. They had valued waterproofing above all else, believing rain, slush, and melting snow were the greatest threats. But in the deep winter forests of Europe, it wasn't external water infiltrating the boot that caused catastrophic injuries. It was internal moisture that could not escape. The German approach had taken a different path. Their felt boots weren't waterproof in the conventional sense. If a soldier stood in a puddle or crept through marshland, water would seep through. But in dry snow and sub-zero air, the exact environment where frostbite thrives, the boots allowed sweat vapor to move outward and dissipate, keeping the interior far drier. And dryness inside the boot, not waterproofing from outside sources, was what saved feet in these specific conditions. The price Americans paid for prioritizing the wrong variable was staggering. As the winter of 1944-45 deepened, aid stations filled beyond capacity. Thousands of men who had survived rifle fire, machine gun ambushes, and artillery bombardments now arrived unable to walk because their feet had swollen, blistered, or turned ghostly white. Doctors recorded case after case of trench foot so advanced that removing socks tore away skin. Surgeons operated around the clock, amputating toes, entire forefeet, sometimes both feet. Many soldiers left the battlefield permanently disabled, not because of enemy fire, but because their boots had failed to protect them against the cold. In some frontline regiments, the tally of men evacuated for cold injuries exceeded the number removed for combat wounds during the harshest weeks of the Battle of the Bulge. Entire units saw their fighting strength evaporate without a shot being fired. For the men on the ground, the crisis was deeply personal. Imagine being a rifleman who has survived months of campaigns. North Africa, Normandy, the push into France, dodging bullets, crawling under artillery shells, dragging wounded friends out of blast craters. Think of enduring everything the enemy could throw at you, only to feel an odd numbness creeping across your toes during a night watch shift. At first, you dismiss it. Everyone's feet feel cold. But the numbness spreads. It refuses to fade. You recall the warnings from medics. You've already seen soldiers carried off on stretchers because of it. When you finally gather the courage to remove your boot, your sock peels away wet and icy. Beneath it, the skin looks pale, waxy, lifeless. You realize you're going to lose at least a couple of toes, maybe more. And the worst part is knowing the enemy didn't do this to you. The environment did, and the equipment you were issued, equipment meant to safeguard your survival, let the cold inside. This was the grim reality thousands of American infantrymen faced through that brutal European winter. The boot model that was created to be their shield had become one of their greatest liabilities. Technology that seemed state-of-the-art in a factory test chamber crumbled under the merciless physics of real combat conditions. In desperation, some units tried their own inventions. A few soldiers punched tiny holes through the rubber soles, hoping the punctures would create ventilation. Instead, the holes let snow and slush seep inside while still trapping vapor. The results were even worse. Others discarded the removable felt insoles, thinking the thinner layer might help their feet stay warmer. Instead, their soles froze faster. A handful of soldiers who managed to capture German felt boots or barter for them with prisoners discovered almost immediate relief. They experienced drier feet and regained sensation within hours. Proof of how different the two design philosophies truly were. But these instances were rare exceptions. The majority simply had no choice but to continue wearing whatever the supply sergeants handed out. And so the casualty numbers climbed. Cold weather injuries soon became a major section in every after-action report. Non-battle casualty charts grew at an alarming rate. The medical corps begged for changes. Quartermasters scrambled for solutions. Eventually, the Army responded by accelerating modified boot designs, experimenting with alternate materials, and improving the distribution of extra socks and foot powder. But by the time better procedures and improved models reached the line, the worst months, December 1944 and January 1945, had already passed. For the men who weathered those weeks, the fixes arrived far too late. In the months after the war ended, the Army undertook a massive investigation to understand exactly how this disaster unfolded. Engineers ran laboratory experiments measuring the way moisture behaves inside boots during long marches. Doctors compiled detailed medical records showing the stages of frostbite progression linked to specific footwear types. Officers from the General Board reviewed thousands of testimonies and field notes from battalions that had fought through the Ardennes. Their conclusion was inescapable. The Shoepac had been conceived with the wrong priority. Waterproofing had been valued above breathability. The rubber barrier that made perfect sense for wet climates was a fatal flaw in dry, frigid conditions. Meanwhile, the German felt boot succeeded because it allowed constant vapor release through nearly its entire upper structure. That single design choice, simple, unglamorous, rooted in physics rather than innovation, had saved countless German soldiers from crippling cold injuries. The American boot, on the other hand, trapped sweat exactly where it became dangerous. The error lay not in construction quality or lack of modern materials. Companies like United States Rubber Company and Goodyear produced the Shoepacs precisely as ordered. The flaw was in the blueprint itself. The specification had been developed around assumptions that did not match the environment the soldiers ultimately faced. American engineers had believed they could outdo traditional designs by adding rubber barriers, combining multiple materials, and creating removable insoles. They aimed for a boot that could handle mud, slush, and rain. But they hadn't fully grasped why the German felt boot, humble as it appeared, excelled in harsh cold. Wool felt breathes. It wicks moisture. It continues to insulate even when damp. And most importantly, it prevents internal water buildup, the true enemy in sub-zero temperatures. The German engineers had tailored their design precisely to the climate of the Eastern Front. American engineers, by contrast, solved for a hypothetical problem set rather than the actual environment. They prepared for wet conditions that rarely materialized during the coldest months of European winter. And because of that mismatch, thousands of American soldiers paid the price. The human cost was enormous. Conservative estimates placed the total number of cold weather foot injuries across U.S. forces during the winter of 1944-45 between 46,000 and 71,000. Many required evacuation from the front lines. Hundreds endured partial amputations. Many more suffered lifelong nerve damage, chronic pain, or mobility impairment. These losses brought no tactical gain. They were avoidable, tragic consequences of inadequate preparation and flawed design logic. Men who had survived machine gun nests, mortar bombardments, and tank assaults lost the ability to stand simply because their footwear held in too much liquid. The aftermath reshaped military procurement philosophy. New winter boot models incorporated lessons learned. Layered systems that emphasize breathability first, then insulation, and only finally waterproofing where appropriate. Training programs were rewritten to teach soldiers strict foot care discipline, sock rotation, and moisture management, all practices that became standard in the decades that followed. The Korean War saw further improvements, though challenges remained in Korea's harsher climates. Modern armies eventually developed advanced cold weather gear using synthetic breathable fabrics, vapor-permeable membranes, and moisture-wicking liners. They learned to integrate vapor barriers only in controlled ways as part of complete systems, not as standalone solutions, because the bitter memory of World War II's frozen casualties served as a warning about what happens when sweat becomes trapped inside a boot. And so, decades later, the lesson remains. The German felt boot had succeeded not because it boasted cutting-edge technology or an especially innovative design, but because it confronted the true problem soldiers faced in extreme winter: the need for continuous breathability. Its wool-felt upper allowed air to circulate and moisture to escape. The American Shoepac, in contrast, sealed that moisture in with a tall rubber barrier extending far above the sole. In solving the wrong problem, the American design created a new one far deadlier. The tragedy is that nothing about the solution was hidden. Anyone who studied the German boot closely could see that its simplicity was deliberate. The material choices aligned perfectly with the environmental demands. The felt construction wasn't crude. It was purpose-built. The American engineering teams improved what didn't need improvement and overlooked what actually saved lives. Every American soldier who suffered frostbite learned this truth in the most painful way possible. Their feet, the very tools of their survival, became the battlefield. And in that silent war between physiology and design flaws, the cold often won. Sometimes the detail that matters isn't a subtle technical nuance. It's the entire foundation of the problem. Sometimes the innovation you trust betrays you because it was designed for the wrong environment. And sometimes, as history has shown, the simplest solution is the one that truly works. Breathable construction through the upper boot. That was the key the German designers understood. That was what protected their troops. And it was the knowledge American engineers failed to prioritize until the price had already been paid by thousands of frozen, broken feet.